Hey there! Welcome to Spectrum Pulse, where we talk about music, movies, art, and culture, and it is my 11th anniversary on this channel. Thank you all so much for watching. I couldn't have made it without you. But now for what I'm gonna cover. Well, okay, here's another glimpse behind the scenes. This past weekend, in between the avalanche of albums that dropped at the end of June that I've still not managed to fully get through, and getting my mid-year video out on time, and continuing on the edits of this long-awaited video essay that's now over 2.5 hours long, I realized I had nearly forgotten about the anniversary voting. So it was a bit of a hasty effort to get the voting live on my community tab as my body tested the limits of possible burnout. I'm doing a little bit too much right now, folks. Not the ideal thing. I need to resolve that. But still, got nearly 100 votes in making picks, and more so than any year before, there was no easy contender that just leapt off the page. I choose to take that as positive, in that I got to the majority of what matters in 2023, and then my audience's tastes are pretty eclectic in and of their own right, which speaks to an intellectual curiosity around art that I appreciate. Good on all y'all. But what that also means is that we only got a couple of albums that actually got multiple votes, and in this case we got a tie between two electronic acts that put out critically acclaimed projects last year, where funnily enough they came roughly from similar scenes in the early 2010s, but their paths diverged radically. In the former case, we got some experimental art pop with some, let's call it, interesting wheedling textures, minimalist techno grooves, and a vocal delivery that I personally feel has not aged particularly well outside of the late 2000s and early 2010s. Now this culminated in an album in 2023 that, after some film score work, was leaning entirely into ambient music. And given how much I love to get on my ambient bullshit, I was absolutely intrigued. Now the other one felt a bit more rooted in Vaporwave, but would steadily expand to pick up touches of post-punk and early 90s Baggy, with its own gauzy, wheedling textures and questionable vocals. Although there was that 2018 effort that pushed to add more swagger that I'd say mostly worked. And thus the two artists and the two albums in question, well, the first is Atlas by Laurel Halo, which for ambient music it's creaking and ethereal in the integration of some strings, but can feel a little choppy in transitions, arguably just leaves me with less to talk about. It's a fine effort, but given how I've largely felt distant from Laurel Halo's catalog as a whole, it wasn't one that pulled me in as much as I would like. And you know, for an anniversary video, I prefer we get something with a bit more impact, so without further ado, from George Clanton, Urap Aya. Now this was indeed a bit of a weird case for me, because there's also a certain distance I have from this American producer, but that springs from a conversation that I have largely ducked throughout my time as a critic on YouTube: Vaporwave. Now, part of this is simply a matter of place and time. Vaporwave was really breaking out just before I started out as a critic, and while I was pretty online in the early 2010s, I wasn't really in the spaces where Vaporwave would propagate that were more driven off of hazy nostalgia, ironic reinterpretations of chillwave, all of the memes, and the sheer melting pot of blog-era genre terminology. It's largely forgotten and makes me feel a little bit better about when I was trying to coin terms of my own when I started on YouTube. Now, the terminology was coined in a similar time frame as hypnagogic pop, which has stuck around a little more, but I was able to connect with that subgenre more quickly, mostly because for as woozy as it could be, there was a weirder, more organic foundation than how Vaporwave felt very entrenched in a less tangible, amorphous vibe, that as soon as it was getting acclaim, a lot of folks were calling it dead. And I'm not even getting into the political appropriations of the genre in the mid-2010s, of which I would argue nobody clearly won that battle, even if one side could lean into nostalgia for some of that edge. But I also think George Clanton got the hint earlier than some others. While he came up in that early 2010 scene, he founded his own label and his own Vaporwave festival in 2019, he doesn't really consider himself a part of that genre, at least under his own name. And going back to his first two solo albums, I would largely largely agree. The nostalgic touch was certainly there, but the irony is largely gone, and the sound has steadily expanded into rattling post-punk and baggy, the predominantly UK-based dance textures of the late 80s and early 90s that would predate Britpop and trip-hop. Now that album was Slide in 2018, an album that if I wasn't so overworked that year, I probably should have reviewed it, although I'm not sure I would have been all that positive, as the production can feel rather muddy and I have just never been that fond of Clanton's lyrics or singing. I know the lack of traditional polish is supposed to lend those vocals more charm in a very 90s sort of way, but for me it just felt really hit and miss emotionally how it would work on that album. But nevertheless, after doing a project with 311 vocalist Nick Hexum in 2020, and that's a choice, he finally returned in 2023 with another proper solo album that just ran up a lot of critical acclaim. So what do I think? Well, let me put it like this. It's probably the most I've liked a George Clanton project in terms of structuring hooks and overall presentation. It's easily his most polished and glossy and pop-friendly, where the 90s nostalgic niche is most defined with the off-kilter, ponderous swells to pull forth those memories. But on another level, it really just is a slight variance and amplification on his formula, which means that if you've got underlying issues with this catalog, and I kinda do, they haven't really gone away. But I also know some of those issues are idiosyncratic to me, so I'm not at all surprised this received a ton of critical acclaim in certain spaces, especially for a certain subset of late Gen X, elder millennial critics, for which this will tunnel into their nostalgia window, but kinda just glances off of mine. In fact, you know what? Let's start off with the primary issue. I still don't really love Clanton's voice with its distinctly 90s nasal drawl, and that can be very hit and miss for me. Some of this is just an issue of texture. I have similar frustrating problems with Eve's tumor, and it drives me off the wall. Vocals that strike timbres that just don't really work, but I can't deny that it does make sense for this sound, reminiscent of Manchester and late 80s, early 90s dream pop and shoegaze and proto-Britpop, where Clanton has referenced Oasis as an influence on the writing of this album, and I definitely hear some Gallagher touches in the increasingly spacious and heavy mix, and lyrics that will gesture at bigger emotions that can never quite be fully defined. Now, for what it's worth, I actually think the style of writing works pretty well for Clanton. It's a little bit underwritten and thinly sketched for my taste, but where the mix can feel near psychedelic, where trying to capture the emotion in words can be a tangible struggle, the glossy days of trying to assemble one's thoughts, it makes sense, especially when you start digging in between the lines. One thing that kind of strikes me is there's some level of existential confusion as Clanton attempts to take stock of where he is amidst the unabashed proclamations of love, where the more than a few songs seem to be directly challenging some of his own ego in place. Punching Down might seem like a snide jab at the poser who's trying a little too hard to be cool when the music actually penetrates and strikes emotion, but if you hear some of Clanton's stories growing up, it's not far removed. It could be speaking to him directly, nor is the whisper of, "You're never gonna be the Vapor King, you know," on Vapor King SubReal, where you try to establish yourself as a figure in an amorphous scene and subgenre that seems to be fading beyond just pure marketing. It is that heavier note of self-doubt. I've been young might as well be the thesis of growing older, but not really growing up. Developing more understanding as a man reaching his 30s, reflecting on what has happened, so you have him holding on to whatever could possibly work. So a cut like Fucking Up My Life is sung with his wife, or the title track's profession of believing there is more to life, but wondering what might care at the core. This internal contradiction that tumbles across waves of existential confusion, where detachment might be the survival state, but fuck, that's not living. Even if living can barely even make sense these days, so I guess it's worth trying anyway. It's why it makes so much sense that Clanton has continued to deflect from anyone asking for the meaning of the title Urapaya, crystallizing that idea that would feel very 90s, except I don't get a shred of irony here. And personally, that's all for the better. Of course, a lot of what I was describing isn't what tends to get the most praise from Clanton. A lot of folks haven't really dug into the lyrics. That comes with production and vibes, which Urap-aya ramps up to 11. Right from that huge blast of percussive synths on the opener Everything I Want, it's evidence that Clanton has buffed up his formula to a mere sheen, but still allows the underlying grooves to have so much undulating swagger, where the vocals are just subsumed into the storm of glossy synth and guitar and bass. Even the occasional touch of horns and woodwinds, it's all designed to just wash over you. But once you've moved past that initial tactile feeling, there is a lot to appreciate in the vibes and the subtler moments. The reverbed phaser effects around the steady build of Justify Your Life, like even more angular and electronic on Punching Down, or the more lo-fi, turbulent soundscape of Vapor King's SubReal, where the groove nearly smothers the mix until the beats switch into something with more house textures, with vocal harmonies that almost recall vintage 1960s psychedelia, or how on the title track the dreamy vibes, the touches of horns, they accent that really nice subtle bass line, or how Hatchie is just an inspired choice for the closing track For You I Will in some of those cooing backing vocals. And I was very much on board for the woodwinds on You Hold the Key and I Found It, and then as much as I like the shuffling groove, some of the frustrating elements of Clanton's mix really started to rear their heads. To be blunt, the sheer number of higher frequencies left amidst the cacophonous royal had me wishing for a really proper low-pass filter, because they're constantly needling the vibe in ways that just don't feel that intentional, especially when it happens again on the title track or Justify Your Life or Fuck Up My Life, and hold them back from feeling greater. But the larger issue might just be compositional, and that it can become tricky to pinpoint some of the primary melodies driving these songs. Obviously, it's more of a textural experience, but if you're looking for that standout pop melodic hook, it can often feel like you're trudging through some of these mixes to find something that really sticks, especially as these songs tend to run long. Now, the obvious exception is the I've Been Young, the easy album standout with the gleaming keys and by far the strongest hook, where the weary sentimentality finally has the composition that can pay it off, where even I was mostly on board for the Savage Garden-esque faster vocals on the verses, probably the closest thing to rap that's actually on this album. Although I will say, the scratching brought into the percussion on Justify Your Life, that was a nice touch. I really appreciated it. But as a whole, for as much as the larger conversation around Vaporwave has been rooted in nostalgia that's wrapped around irony, there's something that feels very emotionally honest about how George Clanton approaches his own brand of nostalgia. It's very explicitly not a subversion so much as a tired, yearning dream for something that could have meant more, and more often than not, it did mean more, even if nobody would really admit it. That's ultimately why, despite every rough edge or texture that doesn't work, or the feeling that there is a deeper insight we're not quite getting, I do like this album. It's not great, it's shaggy, it gestures at more potent ideas than ultimately landing on them. And if this brand of nostalgia is played out for you, or you just remember too much of this era, truth be told, I don't think the compositions are sharp enough to really punch that much higher. But as it is, the textural blend is really compelling, and even if tighter construction might do it better, George Clanton certainly delivers some pretty good vibes. If you missed this last year, I recommend you give it a proper shot. So yeah, thanks a lot everyone for watching. If you want to see more, please be sure to like, share, drop comments, subscribe. Again, I have to thank you all for sticking around for 11 years. I've talked before that the average YouTube channel doesn't run longer than 5. We're more than doubled it. And honestly, it feels like I just keep getting going. There's more that I can work on, more to say, more to do. And that's really thrilling, honestly. I never feel like I run out of ideas on this channel. And speaking of long gestating ideas, the video essay, we're in the final stages. I'm close. The editing, we're getting there. It's going to be long as hell, and I have no idea how I'm going to get past copyright, but we're working on it. We're getting there. Beyond that, though, again, I have to thank you all so much for watching, supporting the channel, even just watching just regularly, keeping subscribed. I know I'll gesture towards the Patreon, where if you want to support the channel with more actual financial backing, get albums onto my schedule, yell at me on my Discord. We got a fun little community there. It's nice. Of course, that's very welcome, but you don't have to. Again, I appreciate everyone who does, but again, the fact that y'all just have come back to keep on watching does speak the world. I genuinely mean that. Thank you all so much. Beyond that, though, anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, I'm all ears. And again, I'm Mark. You're watching Spectrum Pulse, 11 years in, and I'll see you next time.